Welcome to the 5th Harvard Data Science Initiative Bias Square Seminar. I'm Francesca Dominici, and together with David Parks, I'm one of the Harvard Data Science Initiative 2 faculty co-directors. This series is part of our largest Bias Square program, which we launched in September last year as part of our efforts to address the structures in our fields that reinforce bias and systemic racism, while at the same time looking to promote the good that can come from data science through uncovering bias in present-day decision system and by getting better outcomes through the use of data science. The monthly seminars in this flagship series also complement a newly established research fund and an expanded fellowship program at the Harvard Data Science Initiative. Now it is my honor to introduce Desmond Patton and Kathy McKeown, who are sharing their experience with creating a race plus equity task force in data science at Columbia University. Desmond is a professor at the School of Social Work at Columbia University and also Associate Dean for Curriculum Innovation and Academic Affairs. He was the recipient of the 2018 Deborah Paget Early Career Achievement Award from the Society of Social Work Research and also a 2017-2018 fellow at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. As the director of the SAFE Lab, Professor Patton uses qualitative and computational data collection methods to study the ways in which gang-involved youth conceptualize threats on social media and the extent to which social media shapes and facilitates youth and gang violence. Desmond is also a member of the Columbia's Data Science Institute. Kathy McKeown is the Henry and Gertrude Rothschild Professor of Computer Science at Columbia University. She has too many awards and recognition for me to mention, including being an ACM Fellow, a AAAI Fellow, and Association of Computational Linguistic Founding Fellow, and the recipient of the Anita Borg Women of Vision Award in Innovation. Kathy has made landmark contribution to natural language processing, summarization, natural language generation, and in recent years, the analysis of social media. She serves in numerous leadership roles, notably department chair and as a founding director of Columbia Data Science Institute. As you can imagine, we are very happy and delighted to have Desmond and Kathy with us today to share their experiences in creating a race plus equity task force in data science. As a reminder, you might pose your questions for Desmond and Kathy throughout their talk using the Q&A functionality in Zoom at the bottom of our screen. My colleague, David Parks, will be moderating the discussion. Desmond and Katie, I am handing it to you.
Thank you so very much. It's so good to be with all of you this afternoon. I'm a big fan of the work happening at the Data Science Initiative at Harvard. I've spent a lot of time at Harvard as a Berkman Fellow, current faculty associate, was also a fellow at the Carr Center, and was living on Park Street by Radcliffe this time last year. So it's nice to be with you virtually. I just wanted to give you a bit more context about who I am, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Kathy. In addition to my roles in the School of Social Work, I'm also the Associate Director of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative at the Data Science Institute, and that started this January. And so Kathy and I have been working on these issues as colleagues in research, but also as co-chairs on the Racial Equity Advisory in the Data Science Institute. And so we have been having invigorating, exciting, and difficult conversations about this intersection of race and data science. And we look forward to spending time with you today. Kathy, any additional points you want to add?
Not really. I think both of you have said a lot. I guess I would say that I've really enjoyed my work with Desmond, which started out primarily in research, and we'll be saying a bit more about that as time goes on. And I feel very honored to be co-chairing this advisory task force with him. And I feel that we have and we will achieve a lot through it.
Wonderful. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, so bear with me one moment. Okay, so this is our title slide. We just went through that. Let me just give you the run of show for this afternoon, and then we'll jump right in. And so first, Kathy and I just want to be clear that we're going to have an informal conversation with each other, something that we do often. But I thought it would be nice for you to kind of hear us talk about the motivating factors for not only our research together, but why we got involved in doing race and data science work at the Data Science Institute. I think what's interesting about our collaborations is that we have very different positionalities. I'm a gay Black man. I'm 39 years old, and I look different than Kathy. And so we bring our whole selves and our positionalities to the work. We have different positionalities in the university, and it's been a really exciting kind of collaboration in that space. Then we want to talk about the Racial Equity Advisory Group that we have been co-chairing since, I think, the summer. We want to talk about some of the challenges in that space and doing that work at both the institutional but also societal level. And then we want to end on what we believe is the promise of this work. And so that's how we're hoping this afternoon goes with you all. So we first wanted to just bring you into our research world so that you have a bit more understanding of the work that we've been up to. So before meeting Kathy, I was a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and the School of Information. And I am a social worker and a youth violence researcher. And for several years, I have been trying to understand how young Black and Latinx youth make sense and make meaning of violence, particularly in the city of Chicago, and the ways in which emerging technology tools amplify various forms of violence. And so around 2012, I became uniquely interested in this phenomenon because journalists began to write about beefs that were unfolding on social media between rappers in Chicago. And one of those rappers was pretty much fed up with that beef and then posted his location on Twitter. And within 3 hours, he was murdered in that exact location. And so I was fascinated. I was saddened by that particular event. And so I went directly to the literature to learn more about this phenomenon, and there was essentially nothing there. And so that began my work in this area of social media and youth-based violence. A part of the challenge and a part of that initial conception was that the violence that was happening in the community was also being narrated on social media, but we weren't making direct links between the relationship between that narration and violence and the extent to which that situation, those events might be racialized. And so I started to do qualitative work, doing interviews with young people in Chicago, spending time with current and formerly gang-involved young people to really understand what was happening in their neighborhoods. And the things that kept coming up is that they were living their lives online, and that social media really needed to be thought of as a neighborhood or a new environmental context, where it wasn't a situation of that young people were using the tool to just be violent. It was that aspects of their life included violence, and that talking about that within the social media space was how they dealt with and processed those experiences. And so after those interviews, I was beginning to learn more about the context, but I realized that I wasn't examining the totality of social media, and I didn't have the right tools to do that. And so I started to think about, well, what might be better tools to be able to look at larger data sets of social media data. And so in 2015, I then came to Columbia and started a new tenure track job at the School of Social Work in 2015. And one of the first people that welcomed me and connected with me on research was Kathy McKeown, who was then the inaugural director of the Data Science Institute. And I had an opportunity to bring a case to her that I had just began exploring qualitatively, which is the story of Jakira Barnes. Jakira Barnes was a young person that I learned about from media articles in 2014. This was the headline that captured my attention. It said, Chicago's gun-toting gang girl, Little Snoop. And so for those of you who might be familiar with The Wire, this is the character Little Snoop from The Wire. What's interesting about her story, which is very different, is that she was a young girl that was in a gang, but she was a shooter or a hitter in that gang, which is a position that is rarely attributed to young girls. And that there was this interesting mythology that was unfolding online that suggested that by the time she was 17 years old, that she had shot or killed up to 20 people. And so I became fascinated in this story. And then the article provided a link to her Twitter account, which at the time was named Taekwon Assassin. And so with my colleagues from the Safe Lab, we began to look at some of the posts that were a part of her Twitter profile. Another important feature is that Jakira was very active on Twitter. She had around 5,000 followers, around 28,000 tweets, which placed her in the top percentile of Twitter users in that time period. And so I brought this case to Kathy's NLP group. So Kathy, I'm really curious, how did you feel when I presented this particular case to your NLP group back in 2015?
So I first will say a bit about when Desmond came to talk to me. As director, many people around the university were coming to talk to me to tell me about their work, for which they sometimes didn't have the background, the technical tools, and they wanted to start up an interaction. And usually I would pair them with other people within the Institute. But when Desmond came to talk to me and he described his work, I found it so interesting that I thought, I'm going to be selfish and I won't pair it with somebody else. I am interested in doing this work. So Desmond came and gave a talk at our NLP group. And this was really electrifying. The kind of data that he was talking about, was not data that we had really seen before. And the potential for social impact was huge. Again, something that we don't always have the experience with. I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, but this looked to be an interdisciplinary collaboration that was really quite different from what I had done before. So just to say a bit about the challenges, we were looking at Twitter posts made by gang-involved youth in Chicago. And so the language was very different from any language that our NLP tools had been developed for. NLP tools are typically trained on the Wall Street Journal and news. And so, they weren't going to carry over to the kind of language we were seeing here, which is both a mix of AAV, but also includes a lot of slang that comes from that particular group and is very, I guess, we would say localized to the region and to the people in the group. So for natural language processing, it posed some tremendous challenges, being able to handle this kind of language when our tools have not been trained on it. Desmond was very focused on the role of context in interpretation. And that is also something that is a challenge for NLP. And then we had a huge possible takeaway, which is Desmond's group was analyzing, studying, and annotating, really to fully understand what's being said and to have that kind of background, insight, and interpretation and annotations is something that we typically do not have. And we had a lot of ability to interact around it, to discuss it, to say what we could do for and how that might impact the annotation, but also for them to say what they could do. And yeah, and then I'll say as I enjoy interdisciplinary work because I'm talking to people outside of computer science with very different perspectives, and to be able to work with social work researchers brought in also a very different perspective, and Desmond in the course of the work brought people into our group meetings who came from the community. And so again, this was very eye-opening to the computer science researchers and students who I typically work with.
Thanks, Kathy. I think, what's also important for me to note is that when I approached Kathy, I didn't really know what I was doing or what the possibilities would be. All I knew is that as a youth violence researcher, there was something happening on social media that we needed to pay attention to. And also in these very beginning stages, for me, this wasn't necessarily a problem around race. I was studying Black children and Black people, but in those early days, and I always talk about how this was actually problematic, I wasn't really focused on the extent to which our work together could be challenging or problematic as it relates to issues of race. And we can talk more about that as well. But together we have been exploring text in very complex ways. And I think what's been really fun and appreciative about working with Kathy and her team is that they have valued and respected the social work and community insights that have been brought to how we unpack and analyze the data sets. And as Kathy mentioned, one of the things that we do as social work researchers is that we center the lived experiences of minoritized and marginalized communities. And what that meant for me is that we didn't know what the hell young people were saying online. And so we need to treat young people as experts on their own lived experience and to really work with them to do a couple of things, to translate and interpret language and context, because the context around a situation or an event that happens in the community or in the world also informs how we interpret words in conversations. But we also needed to be in community with young people because we weren't necessarily sure that this work was actually beneficial for them. And that we began to see that with the slightest misinterpretation, that it could wreak havoc on how these tools that we are developing can affect Black and Brown communities. And I think over time, it became very clear that this needs to be at the center of the work, that we cannot not consider one's race as we think about the deployment of these tools in Black communities. And so this has really been at the core and has anchored the work that Kathy and I have been doing. And so one of the things that I was really excited about in terms of working with Kathy is the use of natural language processing analysis on these data sets that were centered around Jakira's Twitter network. And one of the first things that I remember from those earlier meetings is that none of the tools that Kathy's team offered initially worked on the data set. So Kathy, I would love for you to talk more about your first entree into applying NLP on this particular data set?
So, well, we went through several iterations, but the one that I'm mentioning here is where we developed a deep learning approach to identifying loss and aggression and experimented with different architectures. And of course, when you go to deep learning, having data is critical. So we had a very large collection of tweets, over 1 million. We looked at ways to gather more, and we had a smaller collection of labeled tweets, which Desmond and his group had analyzed. And as I mentioned, we had quite a bit of back and forth, both for us to be able to understand the interpretations and for the social work team to understand, what would be helpful in our work. So we found out a number of things in the course of doing this. We did experiment with we did experiment with different data sets and how that impacted the accuracy. And what we found was having the data set that was very specific to our demographic. So that was the hyperlocal language of the group that we were studying, resulted in far greater gains in accuracy, despite the fact that it was smaller. So we compared it with training our data sets using, at this point, it was not yet BERT, so we were with Word2Vec, and we experimented with training it on the traditional Google data sets, which were quite large, some pre-trained models. We compared it with training it on a data set of AAV in social media collected at University of Massachusetts. And then again with our own, and our own, although the smallest of the three, was more accurate, I should say. Yeah. So that was one observation, that we definitely needed to be able to study using the language, develop systems using the language of the people we were studying. We also found that contextual information, which is something that Desmond had been pointed out, that when they analyzed the tweets, they often found that what meaning was intended depended on what had happened prior to the posting. And without that knowledge of events that had happened in the community, it could be difficult to do a correct interpretation. And of course, as a system, we don't have access to the real world events, but we could have access to other information which had appeared in the posts up to that point in time. That could be emotions that were expressed, content that was expressed, and who people talked to. So this was the kind of contextual information that we used, and we felt it improved accuracy. We have since that time moved to our current focus, which is on identifying grief and emotions of distress that stem from traumatic experiences. And we're looking at traumatic experiences that happen in today's world in the Black community. So for example, experiences with COVID or Black Lives Matter, as well as many other kinds of things. In all of these, our machine learning is based on the data labeled using a qualitative process by the social work researchers.
So one of the most awkward situations that I think we've had as a collective is a time when we were doing error analysis, and the NLP kept automatically identifying the N-word as an aggressive term. And so as a team, as computer scientists and social workers, we had to sit and have a conversation about the different ways in which the N-word could have meaning and be interpreted in different communities. And I think that it probably is a conversation that we would not have had if we didn't have this era in the system. And it became clear to me that this process could not only elucidate errors in how content from Black youth is labeled, but could also spark complicated and difficult conversations between different people and different disciplines around topics of race as well. And so Kathy and I have been having these types of conversations, not just with each other, but with our students as well over the last 6 years.
Yeah, I want to jump in here because, you know, so we have our students come from different backgrounds. So my students were not Black who were on this group. And I had a very mixed group of different ethnic backgrounds who sometimes English wasn't their first language. And in contrast, Desmond had students who often were Black, not always, but often were. And so I think, you know, it was a way to expose the students in my group to issues around race that they otherwise just wouldn't hear about.
And I think not only did it allow for these fruitful conversations, but it also allowed us to have conversations around ethics, around social media and data science, artificial intelligence that I was not having with my students. And I think there were a number of different types of conversations that were unfolding around the use of social media as a data set, having consent from Black youth around looking at their data, even if the IRB has approved for you to do so, or even if the way in which you sign up for a social media account allows for this type of analysis. I think it also led to us being very thoughtful and critical of how we're interpreting language and realizing that, again, we may not be the experts on this interpretation, but we need to find individuals or spaces and places where we can have more expertise in that space. And then, go ahead.
Let me add in here, you know, with the question of understanding what language is being used from an NLP point of view. One of our first suggestions was, well, we should build a dictionary of the vocabulary that we are seeing with you know, some kind of definition or data which describes it. And Desmond pointed out that was really an ethically questionable approach, because in this community that we were studying, they often invented words precisely because they wanted to have their own language and communication that people outside could not understand. So, you know, in some ways, this would not respect that intent of theirs.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think we're in the work, in the lab, we have constantly been vacillating between two very critical issues. On the one hand, we know that young Black and brown youth can die based on what they see on social media. And so this ability to be able to interpret, to intervene in some way has remained important to the work that we're doing. And then the other end, when misinterpretation happens, particularly of innocuous posts, and then can be leveraged for surveillance and mass incarceration, that is another form of state violence that is equally as problematic as well. And so we're constantly having to vacillate between this very real world problem and not really having ethical tools or ethical guidelines and frameworks to draw upon, because oftentimes the conversation is, well, you just shouldn't use AI in this space. But that's not necessarily the case. And it's not necessarily what parents or community members want as well. So being able to have these really hard conversations has been really important to the work. And then also thinking about, well, what happens if you see something that's potentially problematic? As a social worker, I'm a mandated reporter. in this particular situation, we have been looking at historical data. So it was all data from 2014 and we were studying it much later. So typically that wasn't the case. We didn't have those issues come up, but it was something to be thinking about as we were moving forward in the work. So as I've been saying, so Kathy and I have been doing this work and it has caught the attention of the new director of the Data Science Institute. And so in the summer of last year, I was approached by Jeanette Wing, who is the director of the Data Science Institute, as she was beginning to think about issues of race and data science after the murder of George Floyd. And she wrote me a very nice email asking me my opinion of what I think that she should do. And the first thing I told her to do was not form a racial equity task force or advisory, because I feel like oftentimes these spaces are delegitimized and don't have any power. And so it becomes a place to like perform wokeness or perform that we are attending to these issues, but they're not given any real power. And I gave her a bunch of other points. And then she came back to me and said, I want to form a racial equity advisory. And what do you think about doing it? And what do you think about doing it with Kathy? And I think for me, when she mentioned doing it with Kathy, it piqued my interest because what I've also appreciated about this cross-disciplinary work with Kathy is that she's not afraid of hard problems. And so I knew that in working with Kathy, that even if things got hard and challenging, that it wasn't going to be a situation that she just walked away from. And so that was a motivating factor for me around engaging in this task force. So I was convinced over the summer to lead this advisory with Kathy. So Kathy, I'm super interested in your perspective of how this all went down, so, especially because you are the inaugural DSI director. So what does this all mean to you?
So, well, of course, I had seen the Institute be set up. I felt very connected to it. I want to see its success, given that it spans, many schools on campus. It felt like having an advisory in this kind of institution could have a lot of impact because of the fact that it's so interdisciplinary and people are involved from all around campus. I also felt that, and perhaps my background as a woman in computer science and engineering would be helpful. And it would certainly, I, come from a place where I feel I have empathy and can sort of understand. Of course, as we have more discussion, I find that sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. So sometimes things are similar. So when I started at Columbia, I was the only woman in the School of Engineering on the faculty. So I would go to faculty meetings where it was me and a bunch of men. So I thought like, okay, that would give me some insight. But in our conversations on this task force, I found that sometimes things are quite different. And, it's important for me to be able to understand that difference. I should say here, over the summer, we came up with a number of recommendations, some of which could be put in place immediately and some of which would take time. Our recommendations fell into 3 categories. And the first category was modifications to the institution, that we didn't feel there would be ongoing, so initially when we were asked to serve, Jeanette said, we'd like you to come up with recommendations by the end of the summer. And we said, well, we could make some suggestions, but we really thought it would take a longer amount of time. This was a hard problem. We shouldn't be doing it in a rush. So we said, okay, we would come up with recommendations by the end of the summer, but many of them would take longer to put into place and to work out, how they can be addressed. And And some of those were institutional modifications. So we felt that there should be a permanent advisory council. This should not be a short-term thing where we come up with recommendations and then it's abandoned, that this is a long-term, requires a long-term kind of solution. We felt, the group as a whole felt there should be an associate director that would lead this effort. And we all agreed that that should be Desmond, and he took over in that role. We had a number of other recommendations at the institutional level. Desmond, maybe you want to talk a bit more about them, the last two on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had really complicated conversations about diversity statements. And many of you are probably also having complicated conversations because oftentimes, you know, after the summer of 2020, many tech companies and large corporations started to write out these statements and plaster them over their beautiful websites. But the question becomes, are these statements real? And what is the behavior and action that is related to that? And so one of the challenges around that for us was to really think critically around, okay, we have this statement, but are we actually going to put forth the energy and effort and the behavioral changes that are needed to actually actualize and operationalize this type of statement? And so we drafted a statement, but we also committed to ourselves as a committee that we would be a part of this institutional change to actually live out the statement as well. And then in addition to that, there was no diversity tab on the Data Science Institute webpage. And so we were able to develop that. And not only just have a landing page for diversity initiatives and for an update on the advisory, but we also created a resource page with videos and empirical articles and news articles and any type of media that might be related to this topic as well.
Yeah, and let me add on that, that's the last point about resources. One of the things which I kept bringing up, which wasn't very popular, I kept bringing up that we should have some kind of education or training for people, because, you know, I sort of felt that I personally was a kind of, you know, very open to how we should make changes and to what the issues might be, and that there are other people who I didn't feel, you know, were very open initially. And yet even I, who is very open, I was in the discussions that we had, I was constantly hearing things that indicated that there was a lot I needed to learn and that I needed to understand. And so, and I think we would be curious to hear from other people, but what we did as, you know, why Desmond put up this particular page was so that people can self-educate. They can read and learn about what the issues are and how people feel, without having to set up a training process, which puts additional pressure on the small numbers in our community who are Black and who understand the underlying issues to then serve the community in educating other people. So this was why we went with this direction.
Yeah, that was a really important conversation, because I think what was also kind of coming out of that is that folks of color for a long time have been exhausted with needing to educate white people about the work they need to do. And I think it became clear that these types of conversations, you cannot always train your way out of them, and that you have to be able to have a multi-pronged approach that includes education, that includes training, but you also have to have the awareness and the self-determination to want to pursue this topic in a really forceful way. And so the resource page will then enable folks in our community to do that self-work and be able to come to an interdisciplinary conversational space and be prepared to have different types of conversations. and a part of those conversations were also around the research work at the Data Science Institute as well. The DSI has long had a seed grant program. I've been an awardee of this program in the past, and it is an excellent way for us to kind of start impactful research to get pilot data and then be able to apply for much larger grants with NSF or NIH. One of the initiatives was for us to require a diversity statement on the application process so that those applicants can make sure to ensure that those applicants will be considering issues of race and justice and equity and the research that they were doing, that they are having these conversations as a team. And if they are granted, that they are also having these conversations as a research team when they're doing that work as well. In addition to that, we wanted to make sure that we promote research that addresses issues on racial equity and fairness in data science as well. And we were really excited about a new data science working group on race and equity. Kathy, I know that this is something that was of interest to you, especially as someone that set up the initial working groups and centers at the data science. You want to talk more about your thoughts there?
Yeah, so the Data Science Institute had been set up so that we had a number of centers, initially 6, I think, that focused on different research areas within data science. Some of them were more foundational, like machine learning, and some of them were focused more on specific applications like health or media, social science. And we thought that there should be a working group on race and equity, and this would be a place to do research. The whole process is it starts with a working group, and then if there is sufficient interest and energy in sort of projects, then it turns into a center after a year. That's the process for all new centers. We did have a lot of discussion because the question for this kind of working group was, is it more foundational, and will it be looking at issues that go across all of the centers, and we definitely thought there should be interactions with all of the centers because, for example, it might deal with data or bias and, how to address it. But there are also clearly topics that are central to race and equity itself. And, so we thought rather than having something that is just cross-cutting, we should have its own group, which would then interact substantially with the other centers.
Absolutely. All right, I'm gonna move us along more quickly because I know we're running out of time. But also important is that we have clear support for education, mentoring, and outreach. And so one of the things that has been important is that we build university partnerships that include the School of Engineering, but also the School of Arts and Sciences to really support new actions around diversity, equity, and inclusion for the Masters in Data Science program. We host a Masters in Data Science program, and it's been really exciting to think about the possibilities for this Masters in Data Science program that can do a couple of things. Number one is that to create new pipelines for people of color and underrepresented groups to be a part of the Master's program. But you can't just bring folks to the university. You need to have a culture and support for them once they're there as well. So we've been actively thinking about what does mentorship look like? And so it is, and then not only mentorship, but having faculty that look like diverse, that look like the United States as well. And so these are a number of issues that I think are important conversations, not just for Columbia Data Science, but many data science programs throughout our country as well. And so we've been having these direct conversations. We've been talking about having a diversity committee within the admissions process to really think about any challenges or issues of bias that may seep into how we are thinking about who to invite to our master's program as well. And Kathy, you've been really intricately involved in working with so many external organizations as well. Do you want to talk more about the AUCC and JP Morgan Fellowship?
Sure. So one of the people within the Data Science Institute who is focused on doing outreach to, in particular to companies, had established these work with JP Morgan, and they were very interested and wanted to establish a diversity fellowship. So this would provide a way to support people from diverse backgrounds coming into data science. We also have set up and are collaborating on a regular basis with the Atlanta University Consortium of Historically Black Colleges. And so they are setting up a data science institute and a major. And so we've been discussing, what that curriculum would look like, helping them, providing some input with the goal of if the undergraduate and the master's program are aligned, then it's a good platform for a pipeline because people come in with the right kind of background. We're also interested in joint research with that group, and we think the working group could be a good way for that to happen.
Absolutely. So we just wanted to end our conversation with what we think is the promise of the work, and promise and opportunities and things and questions for us all to be thinking through as well. And so, for me, as a social worker who is working in data science, it has been clearly important for us to think about how do we center race in data science, and for that to be something that is a part of traditional conversations about data science. And some of the things that continuously come up in these conversations, or that need to be a part of the conversation, is who is represented in the data, and what does that mean for data sets? Do we have enough context? Do you have the appropriate context? Do you have the appropriate expertise for interpreting and analyzing data sets? And that's something that Kathy and I have talked about, even most recently, is this topic around accuracy that I know that is very important in data science. But is accuracy always the best gauge for success? Particularly when we're talking about data sets that are emblematic of real world problems and marginalized groups. So for example, in our work, if we have a data set that is 100% right with identifying aggressive speech with Black youth, what does that really mean? Is that something that we want? Is that a fair tool? Is that tool going to lead to keeping kids safe? Or is it going to be a tool that's used to lock kids up? And so I think being able to ask these types of questions is extremely important. Something else that we also want to think about is the inclusion of minority and marginalized voices in data science work. And so always in kind of like reflexively thinking about who was at the table. If you're at a data science table and there are no people of color at the table, should you continue the work? Do you have the right expertise there? What are your non-negotiables in that space? What might you do differently? A question you might ask yourself is our data science predominantly white? Why is that? What changes do we need to make? What conversations do we need to have to disrupt that in real time? Do you have pathway programs that are meant to increase diversity of your program? And of course, thinking about what might be missing from that conversation. Are you anticipating problems and challenges? And a part of that is, again, who do you have at the table? Kathy, I know that you've been thinking a lot about, deeper and more robust considerations for social implications. Do you want to talk about kind of what you see as the promise for that as well?
Sure. So, I think when we did the research with Desmond, and we saw very clearly that the kind of data that we used in our systems affects the output, that we need to think about that in all aspects. So whatever tool that we're developing, we need to think about how it affects all communities for, you know, whatever purpose we are developing the tool, and who benefits from it. And I think this interacts with Desmond's point on the last slide, is who is at the table. So in my NLP class last year, when I talked about bias in data and how we might address it, the vast majority of the students, it wasn't entirely it wasn't, we did have some Black students in the class, but it was predominantly white and other ethnic backgrounds. So when we discussed bias in the data, the first question that came up, and which we had to spend a fair amount of time on, was from people in the class who were asking, is there really bias in the data? And if there is, why do we have to pay attention to it? Because that's how the world is. So we initially had this discussion about that question. And it was a real question, but I also got feedback from other students in the class saying, why did we even have to have that discussion? They wanted us to focus more on what we do about it. So yeah, these are considerations, and it does depend on who's at the table in terms of how the conversation goes.
That's a really excellent point, and it leads towards, conversations around, how do we have these types of conversations in the classroom? And a part of those conversations have always been for us in the SAFE Lab around clear and transparent practices. So we currently have a project with the mayor's office here in New York City. And one of the things that was important for us to do is develop a website that spells out exactly what we're doing with data, how we're analyzing data, who's involved and who can be reached, and all the things that someone might need to know about the research that we're doing with the mayor's office, to be very transparent about that. And to also be very clear about non-negotiables. What won't we do? And so in our work, we don't work with the police. When people ask for our data, we don't share our data sets. We may share code, but we don't share the data sets because we're not exactly sure how interpretation will happen and if that interpretation can be used in negative ways or in punitive ways. And then I think we need to have very critical conversations around a focus on algorithmic bias and perhaps towards a shift around human bias as well. So oftentimes we get stuck in the conversation around the machine is doing this, but we're not also considering what we're doing or what we're not doing, or how, or being reflexive about the frames that we bring to interpretation of data, the development of technologies, and how these technologies are disseminated in the world. And I think that conversation should also be looped into a conversation around preparation and training. So what does it mean to train a data scientist to be prepared to develop socially just technologies? Are you sending data scientists in the world that are prepared to develop socially just technologies? So I just want to leave us all with that. So that's the end of our formal presentation. I'll stop sharing, and we're happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. And thank you, Desmond. Thank you for talking so directly, so personally to the work that you've both been doing as scholars, as leaders at your institute. We recognize from that talk the thoughtfulness, the care, the honesty that you're bringing to your work. We also could see, and you painted the story for us so clearly and so beautifully, I think, the way that your collaboration, your deep, long-running collaboration has affected the way you view your own scholarships. And I think you've given us a lot to think through and a lot to explore as we have a conversation now. And it's really just important, and we're very grateful that you're here to share your work with us. We've been getting a lot of questions from the audience, so I think we'll start with some of those. I think I will probably also take the opportunity to ask some questions that we've also been putting together as a team behind the scenes. But let me go with one from the audience first. There was a question. This is a general question. It asks whether machine learning and natural language processing research on racial equity or exploring topics like this is being performed in non-academic settings. for example, by private for-profit research institutes, by companies. The person asking the question says that they exclusively hear about it in academia. Do you have a reaction to that?
In the spaces, so I have been invited to a lot of tech spaces over the last few years, and it has been pretty solely around topics of racial equity. And so folks are definitely having these types of conversations. I think the challenge in these spaces have been the folks that I'm usually talking to don't have any power. And so I'm usually talking to researchers or mid-level managers who are very passionate, who come from, you know, your PhD program or our PhD program, who are interested in these topics. But when it trickles up, it gets lost. And so I definitely think that people are having them, but we need to enable some power for these things to actually lead towards transformation.
So I'm not sure as much about NLP. I think there has, you know, in companies specifically focused on issues of race, I think there has been work looking at issues of bias. For example, you know, I think there tends to be a bit of a focus more on gender. So for example, bias in machine translation, how things might be translated and wanting to correct that bias. I certainly think there is a lot of concern at levels about, you know, issues with image recognition, face recognition, and that companies are certainly looking at that. So I don't know as much on nonprofits. I was waiting to hear what Desmond answered because I thought perhaps there is more work in nonprofits, but I am not aware of it.
Well, there are certainly nonprofits that are focused on issues of race and data science. I'm thinking about Blacks in AI and the forgetting Yeshi's group. I think it's Black. I can't remember the exact name right there. Data for Black Lives. There we go. It took a little minute to come there, but yeah. So there are organizations that are formed and coalesced around these particular issues for sure. But as within the organizations that I've been familiar with in New York City, it's oftentimes the challenge has been around they are pursuing questions that are centered around race and inequity, but don't have the questions to approach data scientists. And so there's a misalignment in kind of matching questions with tools. And one of the things that I did with Microsoft this past fall is that we hosted a workshop where we brought nonprofit folks, we brought medical folks and AI folks to have conversations about leveraging AI for work in Black mental health. And so bringing people together, I think, is an important space too.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. This is directed to you, Desmond. You spoke of the danger of misuse or misinterpretation of this type of research. The questioner asks whether you could speak a bit more to the specifics of how it might be used to benefit the communities that are being studied and how you center those goals in the technical work.
Yeah, I think we've been in this conversation over the last year. So a part of the challenge that we have faced is around a focus on aggression and grief, right? And so in our work, there's too much subjectivity and room for error in the interpretation of what is aggressive. And oftentimes what we define as aggression or aggressive is based on frames that are racialized and biased. And I think we had to have very uncomfortable and hard conversations about what that means for the work. And then I think it pushed us to have new conversations and asking better questions about what are the real challenges and what are the real problems. And when we dug deeper, when we started to spend more time with young people, it became clear that young people were actually using social media as a help-seeking tool as they process complex trauma and grief in their everyday lived experiences. And that perhaps we need to be focusing on the aspects of trauma and grief is we've seen them predict more aggressive conversations. And so one of the things we noted is that young people were coming to Twitter to talk about grief. And then within a 2-day window, that grief would morph into more aggressive comments. And so we decided, okay, we have this empirical note that tells us that grief is the thing that we actually need to be talking about. And when we then went back to youth, they were saying that as well, that there's so much trauma happening in the neighborhood. And so for that, in the research, then Kathy and I decided, you know what, let's switch the effort. That the effort needs to be on understanding narratives of grief, particularly in the Black community, because we don't have the empirical basis to really have really solid and robust conversations. So let's be a part of contributing to the science around grief and around Black grief. And so it sparked a whole new aspect of the work that we were dancing around and doing some work in, but not as dedicated as we are at this juncture.
Yeah, and that also reflects on what I heard Kathy speak very clearly to about the need for new language models. That we didn't have this hyper-local language in our training corpora that we've had as a community for years. I also wanted to ask at this point whether you have in mind any interventions, maybe technical, maybe not, in social media that could prevent death in this population. Do you have any examples of interventions that have worked or interventions that have failed, or have you not been able to get to that yet in your own work?
I mean, we started this work with the goal of intervention, and I think a part of the problem is that we just need to speak with more community members about interventions. And so I think a part of the learning process is to realize when you need to sit back and sit down and engage communities around what's best for them. And so we want to be told from community members, what actually works for you? What do you need? As opposed to us, Columbia professors saying, oh, this is what we think you need to save your life. Like that. We want to move away from that type of dynamic. And so I think that that's where we're sitting now. I have lots of ideas, but I really want those ideas to be informed by young people and by community members. And so I think this work, this new grief work will get us there. We are embedding a portion of the work with a Harlem Digital Grief Project. We're working with community members that are providing grief counseling. And so we're going to be learning a lot from them and going to be co-developing interventions in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll just intersperse a technical question for Kathy about NLP. I mean, you mentioned birds. Are you finding that you can take off-the-shelf models, you can fine-tune them with hyperlocal language, and that will be effective? Or are you finding that you need to train languages from scratch for them to be effective? Train models from scratch?
Well, in our previous work in this area, I guess our last publication was in 2020. And there we were looking at detecting and correcting bias in the earlier model. So we haven't really experimented with fine-tuning BERT on this data. I mean, so I don't know, we would have to try it, but I would say that the language is so different. I wouldn't be sure, what you would want to carry over from, but that's a good question and something that we should try.
Maybe broadening out a little bit. I'm also looking at the time, and again, we have a lot of questions. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, from your research group's perspective and the sociology of your groups. How hard has it been for you to drive conversations? You spoke, I think, Kathy, to different kinds of students, and maybe in addition to what's been difficult, if you could speak more to what the benefits have been to your respective groups.
So I guess I'll start. First, I think this project is tremendously appealing to especially undergraduates in computer science, that undergraduates really want to have an impact, and doing something that has social impact is important. So I have always been able to attract really good undergraduates to work with the project. And I guess I would say that, given that they hear about it before they come in, that, there are a number who are, they perhaps in earlier times have, had some kind of experience, so they're open. But I also do get students who are not, American. They're not born in the U.S. and I think it's harder for students who are not born in the U.S. to understand. I think sometimes they go into conversations, with Desmond's group, just not even understanding any of the connotations of words that are used, and sort of even how to have discussions. So it's definitely eye-opening, and I think students want to have that experience. And I will say that all of our first work that we developed was unfunded. We actually had difficulty getting funding for quite a while, which is another question that we both have, sort of is, nobody wants to fund something that is studying gang-involved youth. It's too risky is what I think. So even though it can have huge impact, I mean, it's again a form of bias. It could have huge impact. It has the potential for, huge amount of help for that community, and yet nobody wants to risk it. So all our work initially was done with undergraduates who, I know you have the same at Harvard, who are totally amazing and could do really good work.
Yeah, and they're completely fearless.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, Desmond, I can jump to something you said right at the end of the presentation. You talked to centering race in data science. Just wanting to ask you, what does the use of the word center mean for you there?
For me, it's about prioritizing and not being afraid to have difficult conversations about race and data science. I think oftentimes we use, proxies like bias, which is important, but oftentimes we mean Black or Asian or Latinx. It means thinking about who was at the table. That means the race of individuals at the table. It means thinking about the data sets, who is comprised of those data sets, and what does it mean when people are not represented? This has huge effects, particularly in the healthcare system, when the data sets are not complete, and yet quick and fast decisions are made about one's healthcare, leveraging artificial intelligence. And what does that mean for the inequalities that we see in the healthcare system? And so do these tools, are these tools continuously perpetuating inequality? And we're not saying race. We continuously focus on terms like bias. And so that's what it means for me.
Thank you. Maybe while we're talking about this aspect and also involvement of students, and I know you both spoke to, I think Kathy especially spoke to this, just because you can do it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, and that you've been learning about these difficult ethical considerations. I wanted to ask whether you've tried to bridge any of your work into the classroom, because obviously my colleague, Barbara Gross at Harvard, for example, has been leading an initiative here with her colleagues in the philosophy department on embedded ethics and trying to find ways to teach ethics in the classroom. But I honestly believe it's just really challenging. And you've been living this through your immersive research. have you found ways to succeed and connect this into the classroom?
I mean, my work with Kathy sparked a new minor in social work on social work and data science. And so now there are cadres of social workers at Columbia that are taking a Python lab, they're taking an emerging tech course, and then they have an elective course that they can take anywhere throughout the university. And this is, I believe, the first minor of its sort in a social work school. So it has direct implications for curriculum and social work.
So I have, I bring this work into my class. So I always discuss the research that, you know, we've been doing, and the students are really interested. And then I have a class more generally on a variety of different methods that have been used for detecting and correcting bias in data sets. I'm hoping this year, Desmond has offered, and I'm hoping this year he will come and talk to my class, because I think he can talk more directly and with, you know, more sort of authority than I can.
Yeah. Maybe we can close on an open-ended question. I wanted to ask each of you whether you're feeling optimistic about the role that data science can play, or whether you're feeling more pessimistic about the role that data science can play.
I always feel optimistic. I think when there are problems, you know, people notice that there are problems and want to fix them. Sometimes they're hard, you know, to address and change. But I always feel optimistic that there is a good role for data science in these problems, and that there are ways going forward that we can address issues. Desmond?
Yeah, I'm definitely optimistic. I've just been pleasantly surprised at, you know, some of my colleagues that are really advocating for change in data science. And I think these colleagues also firmly believe in interdisciplinary work. And I think that we need more folks advocating within data science spaces for transformational justice in this space. And I think we have really important opportunities, but we have to keep having these conversations. We can't be afraid to have really difficult conversations. And we have to train students that are moving into spaces that are also having these difficult conversations as well. So I'm optimistic.
I'm optimistic as well, but I think we all feel the challenges as we work together. I want to thank you for joining us. We at the Harvard Data Science Initiative are so impressed with the work that you're doing and your commitment to this, and the way that you're weaving together your scholarship into, you know, also changing the landscape of data science for good at Columbia is clear. So thank you. We have lots of questions we were not able to get to from the audience. Apologies to the audience out there. Maybe just in closing, I'll mention, Desmond, that actually Yeshi Milner will be our next speaker. So you mentioned Yeshi, the executive director and co-founder of Data for Black Lives. Our next Bias Squared seminar, there's that bias word again, will be held on Thursday, April 22nd at 1:30 p.m. We hope lots of you will be able to join us. And Desmond and Kathy, just want to thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Bye.